Okay, in this video we're going to take a look at arrays versus objects. Right, we're going to compare the two data types and when you should use which one in JavaScript. Okay, so let's just start out with a basic example. We're going to map animals to your initial response of it, like a one-word response, right? So let's say we call that, what should we call the object actually? Should we call it animal response? I don't know, that kind of sounds weird. Well, we could say, how do we feel about a cat? No, we don't like cats. We like dogs, right? So we're going to say, yay. And lastly, we'll just think of something else, like a hippo. Fat. Obviously, this is just an example. Don't read into this too much. I actually love cats, so yeah, let's just keep going. Now, you may or may not want to code this up as an object. So before we get into how you make that decision, first you need to be able to tell how you could write this object as an array instead. Right, and then we can talk about which one we should use. So if we had... Can we redefine this? Yeah, we can. If we had an array, then we could just write no and yay and fat. If we knew... Oh, Jesus Christ. That startled the living shit out of me. I actually pressed one of my macro keys, and because there's no appropriate driver for the macro keys on Ubuntu, it's just mapped them to pseudo-random garble, like G17 is somehow my like Spotify pause or play key. Don't ask me why, but yeah, that startled the living shit out of me because I accidentally pressed on that. Okay, so if we had a secret rule, or maybe it wasn't a secret, but if we had a rule saying that the first element is going to be about a cat and the second one is going to be about a dog, etc., etc., then we could code it up this way. But obviously, how do we know that this first element is about a cat? And especially, maybe we write it down. Maybe I open up a text file, right? And I say, okay, first element is about cats. And the second element is about dogs. Right? And if I had this text file, I would obviously know what this array meant. But this is obviously really tedious. I have to write stuff down, I have to store it, and anybody else reading this is not going to know what I'm talking about. So we want to write this in code. So we want the number 0 to represent a cat. So what we can do is we can write cat in all caps usually. That's just a convention when you write down constants. So if we say cat equals 0, and now we say animal response cats. Let's just print that out, alright? Let's just print that out. It says no. And if we wanted the dog, then we just wrote down the element, the index of the dog here. And we did the same thing for the hippo. And now we can actually access these things. Instead of directly accessing their elements, I could have written 0, but nobody else would know what that is. So instead I would use the names, right, like dog and hippo. And that actually works. That displays the array properly. So this might get a little bit tedious if we have to write down variable names. So what we could do is we could write an object for this, right? And we would just change the code around a little bit. So obviously we have to make quite a few changes, so hang in there. We're almost done. Okay, and now we have to write these slightly long names. Obviously, I encourage you to think of shorter names in your actual programs, but this is just to prove a concept. And there we have it. And now it still works, and now we have a slightly less tedious way of adding elements and maybe changing some stuff around. Okay. And if you look at actual code, at actual big boy code, okay, I will never use that phrase again, I'm sorry. We'll see if we can find a file. And this is uglified and minified, but I beautified it to at least get rid of the uglification. You'll notice, if I can find it, which I cannot. Well, I know there's these huge objects. I just don't know how to find them. I'll search for something like blur. Yeah, I know that was in there. And as you can tell, this is actually used. Right? This approach of storing, this is why you find these objects in the code here, because now you can use p sub nx to encode an integer. So you can now store what would be this object, inside of an array. So you store these keys, you store the values in an array, and you encode the keys as integers. That's the approach we're using here. So we'll see if that's used here. So we'll write p.nx, p sub nx, no. They have to use nx somewhere. Okay, well maybe they didn't use it. Okay, well, no luck here. Aha, so here we have it. So if we have a blur, then we do something here, and this is uglified, so we don't know what DI is from the name. We'd have to look that up, and then we'll find more names that don't make sense. That's the, consequence of uglification. But it's clear that we can now say, well, if animal indices dot cat, then we want to do something. So let's say, so this is asking if the value is equal to a cat. If the animal that we're talking about is a cat, then we want to do something. Do cat stuff, right? So we can keep track of the index and the value just as we would normally with an object. Now, there are two advantages to this. First of all, we now have... So that's how you convert one into the other. Now let's look at the design decisions. For objects, we have the advantage that it's nearly random access. So let's say I added 1 billion elements to this. It would still work fine. So even if I added, 1,000 more animals, I'll get to the dung beetle, and it's, it's the 13 millionth animal. This would still work. And if I want to access the dung beetle element, it wouldn't take me that long. And if instead I code this up as an array, I would need to linearly search through all of the array and go through all 13 million elements and finally find that last one at position 13 million and do something with that. So that's much, much slower for very big arrays. So when the size that you're talking about, the size of the object or array that you're going to make is indeterminate and could be very large, or you know it's very, very large, then you probably want to use an object for the nearly random access. But if you don't have that, if you only know you have only 10 animals or whatever it is, 10, 100, 200, not a whole lot of them, not hundreds of thousands of them, then you can easily use arrays and beat that performance-wise. So that's the first thing. The second thing is if you need a length, then obviously you want to use an array. So if we want to know how many animals are under discussion, then we want to know. Then we want to use an array. And lastly, if we don't want to code up in terms of cleanliness, if we want to keep track of what's under discussion, then we can use a separate variable. We can say current animal index. I guess that's kind of the same. Yeah, so that's not really... We can do that in both ways. We could write a string or whatever. So I'm still thinking about that code, that Scratchpad code, which said if it's equal to blur, then do something. Question is, can we do that with this? So I'm not sure if I've covered all decision cases, but random access versus linear access is the single biggest difference, and length. And maybe accessing the indices, accessing the property name here is very difficult. Well, here that's very easy because we've created this separate associative array for the just for the indices. So we have a way of getting this index while getting this object property name. I don't know if that's possible. Get object property JavaScript. Okay, property name. Okay, so that's pretty cool. I'll remember that. Get own property names. Now let's see if there's one way to do it. I guess you could just say if it's equal to cat. So if you say if animal is equal to cat, right? And if you did it for an array, you said if animal index is equal to animal indices dot gas. So we can do that both ways. So that's not something worth our consideration in under reasonable conditions, that is. Okay, so those are the three things, I guess just two things actually. Spread rest operator. Alright. So that gives us a little bit of prerequisites to work with when we're talking about implementing objects or arrays. We can always convert one into the other. So that's something to keep in mind. So instead of just using arrays, from now on we can actually actively think about what data type we will use and how we'll use it. So that's it. See you in the next one.